Welcome back to Notes of Curiosity, exploring ideas that matter. I'm Alex, and today I'm joined by Eve, our resident expert on all things economics. Today we're diving deep into Robert Gordon's The Rise and Fall of American Growth, a book that really makes you question assumptions about progress. You ready to explore this?
Absolutely. Gordon's book is a fascinating look at how innovation shaped American life. But it's not your typical rah-rah progress story. He argues that the century after 1870 was truly exceptional in terms of transformative growth. But since the 1970s, well, let's just say the pace has left some economists scratching their heads.
It's almost like he's saying, hold on, maybe the best is behind us. Before we get into that debate, though, I think we need to set the stage. Gordon spends a lot of time in the early chapters describing life in America before these huge leaps forward. What kind of picture does he paint?
He actually starts by dismantling a myth. You know, the idea that America in 1870 was this primitive pre-industrial backwater. Gordon says not so fast. He reminds us that even then, the U.S. had already embraced certain elements of the first industrial revolution. Railroads were expanding, factories were emerging, and cities were growing, but...
There's a big but coming.
Yeah.
Right, because my mental image of that era still involves a lot of horse-drawn carriages and gaslight.
Exactly. And that's where Gordon's descriptions get really vivid. He wants us to viscerally understand the daily realities of life back then. For example, he writes, "The lack of electric light meant that the evening hours were truly dark, except for the flickering light of candles or kerosene lamps." He even points out that dinner was usually eaten at midday, partly because using those lamps to illuminate evening meals just wasn't practical.
Wow, that's something I never considered. And it really makes you appreciate how much we take electric light for granted. Were there any other details from that time period that jumped out at you?
Well, here's a shocking one for you. In 1870, the average life expectancy at birth in the U.S. was only about 40 years. And one of the main culprits was something we barely think twice about today: contaminated water. Gordon describes how water for cooking and washing had to be carried in buckets from wells or cisterns, often located at a distance from the house. So not only was this backbreaking labor, but the lack of sanitation contributed to rampant disease outbreaks.
It's amazing how much we've come to take for granted the simple act of turning on a tap and getting clean water. I'm guessing that's one of the reasons Gordon focuses so much on the period between 1870 and 1940, which he calls the era of great inventions.
Absolutely. He dives deep into how innovations during those years utterly transformed daily life. And it wasn't just about convenience, though. Things like indoor plumbing obviously played a huge role. He argues that these inventions fundamentally reshape society, how we work, how we interact, even how we think about time and distance.
So give us a sense of what kind of game changers he's talking about. We've got electric light and running water, but I'm sure there's more.
Oh, much more. Think about the internal combustion engine. Before cars, if you wanted to go somewhere, you walked, rode a horse, or took a train. Suddenly, personal transportation became accessible to everyday people. As Gordon puts it, the automobile opened up new vistas for leisure and recreation, leading to the development of motels, roadside restaurants, and theme parks.
Okay, so road trip suburbs and even the concept of commuting all stem from this one invention. It makes you realize how these innovations rippled outward, changing everything.
And it wasn't just transportation. Communication technologies also exploded during this time. Gordon describes how the telephone, quote, broke down the isolation of rural communities and made it possible to conduct business over long distances. And then, of course, there's the radio. For the first time, people could hear news and entertainment broadcast directly into their homes. It created a shared cultural experience connecting Americans in a way that had never been possible before.
It's like these inventions weren't just tools, they were the building blocks of modern life. And Gordon is arguing that the rate of change during this period was truly unprecedented. But what about healthcare? Did he talk about any medical advancements during this time?
He does, and they're just as significant as the technological innovations. He points out that between 1870 and 1940, life expectancy in the U.S. jumped from 40 years to 63 years. That's an astounding increase. And he attributes it to breakthroughs like the development of anesthesia, which revolutionized surgery, and the discovery of penicillin, which, as Gordon writes, marked the beginning of the antibiotic era.
So not only were people's lives becoming easier and more connected, they were also getting longer and healthier. It really does sound like a period of unparalleled progress. And this is where I think we're heading into the more controversial part of Gordon's argument. He claims that this pace of innovation slowed down considerably after World War II.
You're catching on quickly, and that's exactly where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, continuing our exploration of Robert Gordon's The Rise and Fall of American Growth. Before the break, we were talking about this remarkable period of innovation from 1870 to 1940. But now we're getting into the era that many people might associate with even more progress, the post-World War II boom. What's Gordon's take on this period?
It's interesting because he acknowledges the tremendous economic growth and rising living standards of the post-war era, but here's where he throws a curveball. He argues that a lot of this growth was fueled by temporary
Okay,
factors.
so what kind of temporary factors are we talking about?
Well, for one, you had a young and growing workforce thanks to the baby boom. And after years of wartime rationing and scarcity, there was this pent-up consumer demand. People were eager to spend money on new homes, cars, appliances, all the things they couldn't get during the war. And on top of that, energy was cheap, which made all this consumption even more affordable.
So it sounds like he's saying this boom was partly built on circumstances that couldn't last forever. But even if it was a temporary boost, people were still experiencing real improvements in their lives, right?
Absolutely. In fact, Gordon dedicates several chapters to describing just how dramatically American life changed during this period. He talks about the rise of suburbs fueled by government policies that made home ownership more accessible. Suddenly, families were trading cramped city apartments for single-family homes with yards. And then there's the car, which he calls the defining symbol of post-war affluence. Car ownership exploded, giving people a newfound sense of freedom and mobility.
But didn't all that car ownership lead to some unintended consequences like traffic jams and air pollution?
It did, and Gordon doesn't shy away from those downsides. He points out that the rise of the car also had a profound impact on urban planning, leading to the decline of walkable city centers and the sprawl that characterizes so many American cities today.
It's fascinating how one invention can trigger such a cascade of changes, both positive and negative. But getting back to the idea of progress, what other areas saw significant improvements during this period?
Well, food is a big one. Gordon describes how supermarkets revolutionized the way Americans shopped for groceries. He writes, prior to the 1950s, most Americans shopped for food in small, independent stores. But then supermarkets came along, offering a wider selection of foods at lower prices. And of course, we can't forget about the arrival of fast food. Gordon describes this as, quote, a triumph of convenience over culinary tradition. And he even includes a funny anecdote about a McDonald's franchise owner who calculated that he had sold enough hamburgers to stretch back and forth to the moon 2.5 times.
Okay, that's a pretty vivid image. It sounds like even Gordon, who's known for his somewhat pessimistic outlook, can appreciate the impact of a good burger. But I'm guessing these changes in food, along with the rise of cars and suburbs, also had some implications for health and lifestyle. Did he touch on those at all?
He does. He notes that while these innovations offered convenience and abundance, they also contributed to a more sedentary lifestyle and a shift toward processed foods. He doesn't go as far as to say it was the beginning of America's obesity epidemic, but he definitely hints at a connection.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straightforward path. There are often trade-offs and unintended consequences. But let's move on to another area that experienced massive change during this era of entertainment. And guess if television plays a big role in Gordon's narrative.
It does. He describes how television quickly became the dominant form of entertainment, overshadowing radio and movies. He writes, by 1960, 90% of American households had a television set. And he goes on to describe how this new medium transformed everything from politics to advertising to family life.
I'm curious, did he mention any specific TV shows or events that captured the spirit of this time?
He does. He talks about shows like I Love Lucy and The Ed Sullivan Show, which drew huge audiences and became part of the national conversation. He even quotes a columnist who wrote, television is chewing gum for the eyes, which I thought was a pretty apt description. He also mentions the televised Nixon-Kennedy debates in 1960, which he sees as a pivotal moment in the history of political campaigning.
It's interesting how television created this sense of shared experience with everyone watching the same shows and events. It feels like that sense of unity has become more fragmented in today's world with streaming services and social media.
That's a great point, and it's something Gordon touches on when he discusses the internet and its impact on communication. While he acknowledges the incredible connectivity and access to information that the internet provides, he also expresses some concerns about the potential for isolation and information overload.
Okay, so even amidst all this progress, Gordon is starting to introduce some notes of caution. And I know this is where we get to the heart of his argument. He's ultimately making the case that American growth has slowed down since the 1970s. What does he see as the main reasons for this slowdown?
He explores several factors, but one of his central arguments is that the information technology revolution, despite its incredible impact on our lives, hasn't delivered the same kind of economic boost as earlier waves of innovation.
That's a pretty bold claim, especially considering how much we rely on technology today. Why does he think that is?
He offers a few explanations. One is that many IT innovations have focused on entertainment and communication rather than productivity enhancements. Think about all the time we spend on social media, streaming videos, or playing games. While these activities can be enjoyable, they don't necessarily translate into increased economic output.
Okay, that makes sense. But hasn't technology also made many jobs more efficient?
It has, but Gordon argues that those gains have been largely offset by other factors, like the decline of manufacturing in the U.S., the rise of low-wage service jobs, and the increasing complexity of the global economy.
So it's a more nuanced picture than simply saying technology is making us more productive. It sounds like he's saying we need to look at the bigger economic context. But before we get too deep into that, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The idea that IT hasn't delivered the same kind of economic boost as previous innovations. Could you elaborate on that a bit? What exactly does he mean by economic boost?
He's talking about productivity, which is essentially a measure of how much output we get from each hour of work. It's a key driver of economic growth because if we can produce more goods and services with the same amount of labor, that means higher living standards for everyone. And Gordon argues that despite all the advances in IT productivity growth in the U.S. has been relatively sluggish since the 1970s.
Okay, so that's the crux of his argument. He's saying that even though computers and the internet have changed our lives in profound ways, they haven't translated into the kind of economic gains that we might have expected. And that's what leads him to this somewhat pessimistic view of future growth.
Right. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the challenges he sees on the horizon.
Stay with us. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of Robert Gordon's The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And things are about to get a little bit, well, let's just say Gordon isn't known for his sunny optimism. You ready to tackle the challenges he sees facing American growth?
Absolutely. Gordon doesn't hold back in the final chapters. He lays out several headwinds that he believes could hinder future economic progress.
Okay, so let's break those down. What are some of the biggest challenges he sees on the horizon?
He identifies several key factors, but I think rising inequality is at the top of his list. He points to the growing gap between the rich and the poor in America, and he argues that this trend has serious economic consequences.
Can you elaborate on that? How does inequality tie into economic growth?
Gordon's argument is that when a large portion of the population is struggling to make ends meet, it stifles consumer spending, and consumer spending is a huge driver of economic growth. So if people don't have money to spend, businesses don't grow, and the overall economy suffers, it's a vicious cycle.
It's like the foundation of the economy is getting shaky if that gap keeps widening.
Yeah.
What else does Gordon point to as a potential roadblock to future growth?
He's also concerned about what he calls educational stagnation in the U.S. He argues that a well-educated workforce is crucial for innovation and economic growth, but he sees some troubling trends. For example, he notes that the U.S. has fallen behind other developed countries in terms of high school and college graduation rates.
So it's not just about access to education, it's about the quality of that education and whether it's preparing people for the jobs of the future.
Exactly. And Gordon points to factors like rising college costs and underfunded K-12 schools as contributing to this problem. He writes, "The American education system, once the envy of the world, is now in danger of becoming a source of national weakness."
That's a pretty stark warning. Okay, so we've got inequality in education. What about demographics? I know that's been a topic of concern for economists for a while now.
It's definitely on Gordon's radar. He notes that America, like many developed countries, has an aging population. This means a smaller share of the population is in the workforce, which can slow economic growth. And at the same time, you have a larger share of the population relying on social safety net programs, which can strain government budgets.
It's like we're heading to a demographic crunch with fewer workers supporting a growing number of retirees. Okay, so we've covered inequality, education, and demographics. Is there anything else Gordon sees as a potential threat to future American prosperity?
Well, this might be the most controversial part of his argument. He raises the question of whether technological innovation has reached its limits.
Well, hold on. That's a pretty bold statement. I mean, technology is advancing at an incredible pace. Artificial intelligence, robotics, biotech. There's so much happening right now. How
Yeah.
can he say innovation has hit its limits?
I know it seems counterintuitive, but his argument is that many of the recent advances, while impressive, have been incremental rather than revolutionary. He acknowledges that it's impossible to predict the future of technology, but he expresses skepticism about whether things like AI or 3D printing will have the same transformative impact as, say, electricity or the internal combustion engine.
So it's not that he thinks innovation will stop. It's more that he thinks we might have already picked the low-hanging fruit. The really big game-changing breakthroughs might be behind us.
That's a good way to put it. And to be fair to Gordon, he's not the only economist who's expressed this view. There's a growing debate about whether we've entered an era of slower technological progress.
It's a fascinating debate, and one that has huge implications for the future. If Gordon is right, it means we need to rethink our assumptions about economic growth.
Mm.
We might not be able to rely on technological innovation to solve all our problems and deliver the same level of prosperity that we've become accustomed to.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of the most important takeaways from Gordon's book. He's not trying to be a doom and gloom prophet. He's urging us to be realistic about the challenges ahead and to have a serious conversation about how to address them. He writes, "The future is not predetermined. We have the power to shape it."
So what would that look like? What kind of solutions does he propose?
He doesn't offer any easy fixes, but he does highlight some key areas for action. For example, he emphasizes the importance of investing in education and research, addressing inequality, and promoting sustainable economic policies.
This sounds like he's calling for a more proactive approach to economic policy, rather than just assuming that growth will take care of itself.
Exactly. And that's what makes this book so relevant, even though it was published several years ago. The challenges Gordon identifies are still with us, and they're likely to become even more pressing in the years to come.
It's a lot to think about,
Yeah.
and I appreciate you helping us unpack it all. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Robert Gordon's work, is there a final thought, something provocative that we can leave our listeners pondering?
Well, one thing that struck me as I was rereading the book is that Gordon doesn't really delve into the potential impact of artificial intelligence and robotics on future growth, even though those technologies are rapidly advancing. He touches on automation, but his focus is primarily on the past. So I think it's worth considering how might AI and robotics affect both the rate of innovation and the distribution of income in the coming decades. Could these technologies spark another period of transformative growth, like the one Gordon describes in the early 20th century? Or could they exacerbate existing inequalities, leading to a future where the benefits of progress are concentrated in the hands of a few?
Those are big questions, and ones that we can't fully answer today. But they're certainly worth pondering as we navigate the complexities of the 21st century. I highly recommend Robert Gordon's book to anyone who wants to understand how we got here and where we might be headed. It's a dense read at times, but it's packed with fascinating insights and thought-provoking arguments. And as always, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
This is Alex and Eve. Until next time.
Keep those notes of curiosity flowing.